Welcome to the Global Partnership Podcast. I am your host, Zain Dudar. As you know, the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, or GPEDC, is a unique multi-stakeholder platform that brings together development actors to advance the effectiveness of their development efforts to deliver long-lasting results and contribute to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, including the commitment to leave no one behind. We have what we want to achieve in the 17 SDGs and a framework for what this needs in the financing for development process. Complementing these by addressing how we effectively partner and work together is what we need now to accelerate our efforts and achieve the goals everywhere and for everyone. Since the Paris Declaration of 2005, countries have made significant progress in complying with their responsibilities towards being more effective. And one of the 5 pillars of the declaration that holds the key to sustainable results is a country's ownership of its development process, the main topic of today's episode. And for that, we talk to Mr. Ronald NKUSI, Rwanda's Director for the External Finance Unit.
For us, ownership is really the anchor of all other programs to succeed. If you talk about ownership, the recipient countries or developing countries, they need to own the development discourse that they're actually charting, because if they don't own that, no amount of aid or support that actually could get them the results they want to see. So the ownership begins with the country defining what they want to do. For us, of course, after our tragic history of genocide in 1994, you can realize that the country was really shattered. I mean, the economy wasn't anything you can talk of. The social fabric wasn't there. Reconstructing the human capacities wasn't really there. So in 2000, actually beginning 1999, that's when the government started thinking about how do we rebuild the country that is shattered, that's torn apart, has really nothing to talk about as a country, as a nation. So in 2000, that's when the administration the government came up with a vision of 2020, so defining exactly what we need to do in next 20 years. And there are 6 pillars of that, and one of it being human capital development. Now, in 2005, when the Paris Declaration came up and subsequently the Accra Agenda for Action and later on the Busan, those were things that the government felt that if there is international support, our growth, our development needs to be aligned with those plans and strategies that we've developed for ourselves, for the Vision 2020. So we took Paris and Accra and Busan thereafter as really a kind of forums that we would use to help us implement the plans and strategies that we had defined. So we embraced that and said we are going to own whatever needs to be done. We're going to ask our partners to play by those principles. We're going to be monitoring them. We're going to be assessing them and holding them accountable as we hold ourselves accountable as well on what we are supposed to do and what the donors we are actually supposed to do. That's how we came up with country ownership and country-focused implementation.
The case of Rwanda, as perfectly explained by Mr. Ronald NKUSI, clearly shows how ownership is a key element for development cooperation effectiveness. The last Global Partnership Monitoring exercise also shows that the proportion of partner countries with a high-quality national development strategy has almost doubled since 2011. However, the report also signals the need to step up efforts in support of strengthening national systems and capacity. It is important to note that a record number of 86 partner countries and territories had participated in this last monitoring round. Most of them were low and middle income countries, with almost all least developed countries taking part in the exercise. These 86 countries led a multi-stakeholder data collection effort on the effectiveness of their development cooperation that covers more than 3,300 projects and programs, and more than $58 billion in development cooperation flows disbursed by development partners over the last fiscal year. You will be able to access all this evidence and analyses by visiting the Global Partnership website at effectivecooperation.org. Now, going back to our topic of country ownership and inclusion, I would like to introduce Dr. Paulo Esteves. He is the director of the BRICS Policy Center in Brazil. Dr. Esteves is an expert in South-South cooperation. Now, Dr. Esteves, how do you see the evolution of ownership and what efforts have reinforced broad country ownership?
Okay, so since Paris, ownership became a kind of a buzzword. Every agent refers to ownership, but it's really hard to find a good model. And the reason for that is that most of the time, the recipients, they try to align themselves with the guidelines and the rules established by the donors. And in that case, ownership became a kind of a empty vessel or an empty principle in which the country seems to be consulted, but at the same time, the country, the national or the partner tries all the time to adapt to the expectations of the donor. Since the inception of the 23rd Agenda, we can actually find another layer of complexity, since ownership is not thought to be a principle applied to government, but for the whole society. And in that sense, the 23rd Agenda adds an important caveat with the leaving no one behind approach. The leaving no one behind approach offers a new challenge, which is something that we have to work in the following years. It's not a matter of only of prioritizing those who are left behind, who are further behind, but also include these groups in the very process of formulating and implementing development projects and development programs.
We further asked Dr. Esteves, do you think ownership needs to be reimagined to get all types of development partners on board for a whole of society approach?
Exactly. That's a huge challenge. Once, in a way, it brings to the fore the very idea of representation and problematizes how representative are the governments in partner countries, how representative are the parliaments in partner countries, and how represented are those groups who are often left behind, like indigenous people, women, traditional communities, and so on and so forth. So the leaving one behind approach, it brings to the very concept of ownership a new set of challenges related to intersectional inequalities and how these groups affected by intersectional inequalities are represented in development projects and programs. And if it is a challenge to traditional donors, it's even a more acute challenge for Southern partners, because Southern partners very often work with a very narrow conception of ownership. Ownership for most of Southern partners means the authorization of the partner governments. And the whole society approach and the leaving no one behind approach brings a set of challenges or a set of difficulties for Southern partners, because they have now to revise the very conception of the demand-driven approach for Southern countries, or for those countries which are working with ownership, the very concept of ownership.
Some countries are showing strong governmental leaderships. In your opinion, are these strong leaderships challenging multi-stakeholder approaches?
Yeah, there is a kind of a democratic conundrum in this new understanding of ownership, because to be consistent with a leaving one behind approach to ownership, you must have a solid process of consultation, including not only the different stakeholders, but the groups which are not very often represented in the political process in partner countries. So in that sense, we must make democratic institutions stronger than ever to have an effective concept of ownership, which is consistent with the idea of leaving no one behind.
In the Global Partnership Monitoring Workshop in Bonn, Ms. Salma Al-Khazai, the Director of Aid Management in the Afghan government, explained how Afghanistan is now giving more relevance to effectiveness than in the first years of recovery and big investments of the development cooperation community. At that time, all the attention was given to the reconstruction and government rebuilding process. In this context, she said, and I quote, "We are now more focused on implementation of the development agenda instead of spending money on operation costs, on building new buildings and new offices. End of quote. She also said that previously in Afghanistan, the aid was concentrated in a few big provinces, and there were too many subcontractors. Finally, Ms. NKUSI said, quote, "The government must take some very active steps and some very dramatic steps to make sure we have some effectiveness and focus on using the money in the right place for the right purpose." End quote. Our final question for Dr. Esteves was, do you think the effectiveness agenda needs to evolve in order to remain relevant?
I think so. I think since Busan, since the moment that we observed this change within the effectiveness agenda, from cooperation effectiveness to development effectiveness, we were not able to conceptualize what the development community meant with the idea of development effectiveness. And this is something that we have to further invest now, in the sense that we must align, again, and I'm going back to the leaving one behind issue, because for me, this is the key point of the 23rd agenda. We must have a concept of development effectiveness which actually tackles inequality. In a way, a concept of development effectiveness that brings the excluded groups to the fore and give them precedence, both in terms of the results, but also in terms of participation.
Now, after listening to Dr. Esteves' opinions, we would like to close this episode with the final question to Mr. Ronald NKUSI. Mr. NKUSI, what do you think is the future of ownership for effective development cooperation?
The future is really to even increase the ownership, because for sustainability of these interventions that we are doing as a development community, you need to be making governments more responsible on what the governments are doing. The people need to own their development trajectory. So we will just increase the accountability, the ownership, and we will need to do more of this, not just to account for donor funds, but to account even domestically raised financing, because increasingly we are seeing this as a big part of our national budget financing, domestic resources. So the discipline that will be instilled has to continue, has to be actually sharpened and even improved going forward to make sure that we can achieve more results with whatever financing we have.
In this episode, we have discussed several aspects regarding ownership and inclusion in country-level development strategies. This discussion was sparked by some of the results depicted in the Global Partnership Monitoring Round report. We encourage our listeners to further explore said report, since it provides essential data and evidence to drive dialogue and behavioral change towards more effective development cooperation. You will be able to access the report at the Global Partnership website, effectivecooperation.org. You can also follow the partnership's latest news on facebook.com/devcorporation and on Twitter @devcorporation. Finally, we would like to thank Mr. Ronald NKUSI for his testimony on Rwanda's progress and Dr. Paulo Esteves for his valuable contributions to this episode. That's it for today, with our focus on looking at partner country levels data. In our next episode, we will talk about key report findings from development providers level data. Thank you very much for your attention.